I'm going to be real with you guys. The New Year's 6 games this year, with the exception of one and the playoffs, kind of all suck. And there are no extraordinarily interesting games outside of that. However, there are instances where games could have been interesting, provided that the players actually play them. Now, not so much. But in today's game, we're going to talk about 4 of the 7 bowl games that I did not talk about in part 1 or part 2 of this series. So with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be talking about 4 more bowl games that could have been interesting. We're going to start off with Oklahoma versus Arizona, and we're going to start by comparing the rosters between these two teams, and I have done my best to try to take into account the transfer portal and who is actually going to play in this game and who isn't. Starting with the quarterback position, I believe it is probably going to be Jackson Arnold for Oklahoma instead of General Booty, because he is the freshman and the more talented of the two players, in my opinion. So I think you should probably roll with him versus the slightly more experienced General Booty. And for Arizona, I believe it'll still probably be Jaden DeLora. And even though DeLora hasn't particularly been all that impressive, I think he's a very good college quarterback, but he isn't a world beater by any means, in my opinion. I am going to give Arizona the edge at the quarterback spot just because we don't know what Jackson Arnold looks like. It's perfectly reasonable to say that he comes out and looks absolutely spectacular, because maybe he will, but I'm not going to go out of the way to predict something like that happening. Now, Oklahoma also does tend to turn it on for bowl games and play at their absolute best, which is another thing that's like an outside factor for this. But I think they've just lost too much in the transfer portal here at the quarterback position. Dylan Gabriel at times was their offense. Like, they didn't really have anything else going on. So I'm going to give the edge here to Arizona. At the running back position, I am also going to give the edge to Arizona. Oklahoma has not particularly had a whole lot in the run game outside of Dylan Gabriel scrambling. And Arizona is a run-first football team. Their running backs are, in my opinion, better than Oklahoma's. When it comes to the skill position players, McMillan for Arizona was the deciding factor, because I think they were both pretty in that range of good, not great, in terms of the Power 5 level for skill position players. However, McMillan for Arizona puts them over the top because he is absolutely a great, perhaps even elite player at the Power 5 level. So at the offensive line spot, had Oklahoma not had like 7 different transfers from the offensive line, including several players that started games this year, I probably would have given it to them because their offensive line was pretty good this year. Arizona's was also good. I think it would have been close, but I think I would have just barely given the edge to Oklahoma. But they've lost a lot of depth and some starting caliber players as well. So I am going to just slightly give the edge to Arizona. Where I think this is less of a conversation is the defensive line. Both of these teams' edge play has been subpar, in my opinion. However, along the interior, there is a clear and decisive advantage for Oklahoma. Oklahoma's actually been pretty decent at defending the run game this year, and Arizona hasn't particularly. Now, I don't think that's going to matter a whole lot this year because Oklahoma can't really run the ball. So I am going to give Oklahoma the edge along the defensive lines. At the linebacking core, I mean, honestly, both of these groups have been kind of bad for stretches this year, and most of the time they've just been average to slightly above average. On a coin flip toss, I'm just barely going to give Oklahoma the edge at this position. And the defensive backs, if we were talking about safeties, I think maybe there might be a slight edge for Oklahoma, actually. But when it comes to cornerbacks, this isn't even a conversation, in my opinion. Takario Davis and Traden Stukes have been great this year for Arizona, and Oklahoma does not have anybody near their level or quality of play. So I'm going to give the defensive back edge to Arizona and have them end up having a 5-2 advantage in terms of the roster, which again would be a lot closer had the transfer portal not been as big of an issue for Oklahoma as it has been. So, with the roster kind of taken care of, how does Arizona match up against Oklahoma? And I think overall, I think there is a slight advantage for Oklahoma here in terms of the quarterback versus the defense as a whole. Oklahoma does have a good scheme. Brett Venerables is a very good defensive play caller, and they do still have some pretty good talent along that defense, specifically along the defensive line, where I also think Oklahoma has a bit of an advantage, specifically because of how good and deep their interior defensive line play is, especially against the run game. In order for Arizona to win this game, DeLuca is gonna have to throw the football, and he has shown at times to be able to do that, but I'm not sure the running game, traditional or otherwise, is going to be able to be there consistently for Arizona in this game. However, they do have, I think, a definitive advantage at the skill position player versus the back seven. Oklahoma's cornerbacks on the outside are not particularly good, and once again, McMillan is a borderline elite offensive playmaker, so I do think they're going to be able to get some big plays to him, and I think he's pretty much going to be able to do whatever he wants for the most part. Now, as far as Oklahoma goes, in terms of the quarterback versus the defense, again, unproven quarterback, pretty okay defense. I'm going to go with the defense who's actually shown to be competent at times, as opposed to the quarterback play who we know nothing about. Offensive line versus front seven, this is mainly decided by the passing game to me. Oklahoma isn't great at run blocking, and Arizona isn't particularly good at stopping the run, but Arizona is also not particularly good at rushing the passer, and Oklahoma's offensive line for the most part this year has been pretty solid in pass protection, so I am going to give the edge to Oklahoma there. And when it comes to the skill positions versus the back seven, specifically the secondary, is the strength of Arizona's defense, and none of Oklahoma's skill position players since Andrell Anthony went down with that season-ending injury have particularly impressed me. Drake Stoops is solid, but I think a lot of that production is forced because he's really the only guy who can consistently run routes that get any sort of a separation. So I think his ability and stats are perhaps a bit inflated. And as I said previously, Arizona's secondary is pretty good. I think these two teams are pretty evenly matched when it comes down to it. However, I think Arizona has more starting experience, more playing experience, and I think they have more to gain by winning and more to lose by losing than Oklahoma. So I am going to predict Arizona to win this game by the score of 28-21. I think this will be a little bit of a lower scoring game by Oklahoma standards, mainly because I don't know what the quarterback play looks like. Now, if Jackson Arnold comes out and there's no drop-off in quarterback play, then Oklahoma should win this game by multiple scores. But I don't know if that's going to happen. It could happen, and he could also come out and be absolutely terrible, and they don't even score 21 points. They might struggle to get 10. I don't know. Picking bowl games in the modern era of college football is extraordinarily hard to do. Next game on the schedule is Oregon versus Liberty, and boy, oh boy, this, you can tell by what I've put on the screen here how I think this game is going to go. I'm not particularly going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but since this is a New Year's Six bowl, I thought I probably ought to put it in kind of its own separate video where I talk about the potentially interesting matchups this year. Now, I have been burned several times by Oregon this year when I picked them, so maybe I can jinx it and Liberty will end up getting the W. Who knows? But when it comes to comparing the rosters, I believe Oregon has a definitive and clear advantage at every single position and position group, especially at the quarterback and offensive line positions, who, even though I believe their star center has declared for the draft and opted out of the bowl game, I don't think that Bo Nix has yet. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Oregon has the better overall roster. If Bo Nix isn't playing and I am confused or wrong, or he decides to opt out at the last minute or just before the game, then with Ty Thompson also in the transfer portal, who has been their primary backup this year, I would give the advantage to Liberty at that position. But that is the only position where they have even a chance to be better than Oregon at. But, as I've said before, matchups are all that matters in games like this, not necessarily overall talent on the roster and the difference between the two teams. Unfortunately for Liberty, however, they don't win a single matchup. I'm going to spoil the next slide as well here. They don't win a single matchup here. This is a mismatch of epic proportions. SMU absolutely should have gotten this matchup, not Liberty. But Liberty has that magical 13-0 number that matters for them, but not Florida State, which is just another horrible inconsistency by the College Football Playoff Committee, because SMU is clearly a better football team than Liberty, but they're not ranking them ahead of Liberty because Liberty's undefeated and they won all their games, and they deserve this opportunity because they've gone undefeated and won all their games. But Florida State doesn't deserve shit. Nevertheless, I think Oregon has a definitive advantage versus the quarterback when it comes defensively. I think they have a definitive advantage along the front seven versus the offensive line. I think they have a definitive advantage on the back end versus Liberty's skill position players as well. Up next is the Oregon matchups. And as I said previously, Oregon wins all of them. Bo Nix is the best player on the field when it comes to offense versus defense. Even with a player or two opting out, I do think the Oregon offensive line has the depth to be able to reload there, and I think that Liberty's front seven is just going to get decimated by this mauling offensive line. And when it comes to skill position players versus back seven, yeah, Oregon's going to win that matchup as well. And as you might have been able to see coming, I don't think this is going to be a close game at all. I don't think Liberty has a shot in hell at being able to really do anything against this Oregon team. I don't think they can stop Oregon, and I don't think they can move the ball until probably about the halfway point of the third quarter, where Oregon starts playing all of their true freshmen who they redshirted this year. So I have Oregon winning by the score of 56-17. Next game up here is Ohio State versus Missouri, and this is a much more evenly matched up game than I think I even anticipated coming into this game. And this is really the first game here where neither team has gotten particularly hit hard by the transfer portal. Now, Ohio State did lose their third string wide receiver and two of their top three running backs, and potentially the top running back as well, and also to go along with their starting quarterback Kyle McCord, who just today announced that he was transferring to Syracuse. And salty Ohio State fans immediately went to Twitter to say, oh my God, Ryan Day won 11 games with a Syracuse caliber starting quarterback. All right, chill. This is a new regime. We don't know what Syracuse caliber means. Nevertheless, as of this moment in time, they haven't particularly lost, Ohio State that is, they haven't particularly lost anybody to declaring for the NFL draft. In fact, a majority of players announced that they were going to actually play in this game. So we're going to see both of these teams almost 100% in terms of their quality of team here. So when it comes to quarterback, I am going to go with Missouri here. They have more experience experience at that position. Cook has played pretty well for them this year. However, I don't particularly think there's going to be this massive drop-off going from Kyle McCord to Devin Brown. Devin Brown, a little bit more athletic. He's still probably not someone that you want to draw up run plays for, but he can move around a little bit more in the pocket. At the running back position, it is close. However, I think Travion Henderson probably plays in this game, either if he declares for the NFL draft or if he decides to return for the 2024-2025 season. But even if he doesn't, DJ Hallen, I think is his name, or it might be DJ Hayden, number 4, I think, who has been very, very good in the limited role that he has been able to have this season. With the new redshirt rule saying that bowl games don't count towards eligibility, I believe he's probably going to end up being running back 2 and end up being very effective for this team. So even though Cody Schrader is an underrated back in terms of the national scale here, I don't particularly see this as a conversation or close in any real way. I think Ohio State has the edge at the running back position. Skill position, more of a conversation here. Effectively, I think we can say if Marvin Harrison plays in this game, I do not believe he has made an announcement yet. If he makes one in the future and he opts out of this game, then this segment is going to be a moot point. I can't control what happens in the future. So I'm just going to do what I want to do, which is assume Marvin Harrison plays in this game. In that case, him and Luther Burden, I think, are pretty much a wash at the college level in terms of how good they are. Number 2 wide receivers, Emeka Ibuka, Theo Weiss, I also think is pretty much just a wash. So when it gets to the 3rd wide receivers, you're looking at Carnell Tate versus someone like Mookie Cooper or Mecky Miller. I do think there's a slight edge for Ohio State there. However, this is really going to be decided by the 2nd position that I include in the quote-unquote skill positions here, and that's tight end. And at the tight end position, there is a pretty clear and definitive advantage for Ohio State. So at the skill positions in general, I am going to go ahead and give the edge to Ohio State. Moving on to the offensive line, I do think it is close. However, if we go position by position here, it does lead to a 3-2 advantage for Missouri. So let's real quick go through it here. The tackles for Missouri are Javon Foster and Armand Membo, while the tackles for Ohio State are Josh Fryer and Josh Simmons. I think Membo is better than Simmons, and I think Foster is better than Fryer. However, I think Fryer is better than Membo, so there's a little bit of give and take here, but overall, I would say there is a slight advantage for Missouri at the tackle positions. If we move inside, I think there is actually an advantage for Ohio State at the guard positions. I think Donovan Jackson is the best. I think Matthew Jones is the 2nd best. And I think Xavier Delgado and Cameron Johnson are both good starting caliber Power 5 offensive linemen. However, I don't think they're as good as Matthew Jones and Donovan Jackson. So the center position is really where the tiebreaker kind of comes, and this isn't particularly a conversation. Carson Hinsman has not been very good this year. Connor Tollison has been very, very good. So the defensive line is probably going to be the most controversial opinion that I have on here. However, I firmly believe that Missouri, when you factor in depth, which is very important along the defensive line, has the advantage here. I think Darius Robinson is better than both edge rushers for Ohio State. I think Johnny Walker and Niles Gaddy, who also play quite a bit, are not that big of a drop-off. However, I do think Sawyer and Tui Maloau are both better than those two guys. So I think it goes Missouri, Ohio State, Missouri, Missouri. But the depth for Ohio State is basically non-existent. They pretty much only play Sawyer and Tui Maloau on the edges. And because of that, they do at times get in trouble when it comes to conditioning because they're playing 60, 70 snaps a game. Missouri doesn't have that problem. Now, when you look at the interior, again, Tyleik Williams, Michael Hall Jr., Ty Hamilton, they do rotate those players a bit more than they do on the edges. But for the most part, it's Tyleik Williams and Michael Hall. And Missouri may not have the talent of those guys or even just the skill player. I think Ty Hamilton is maybe a little bit worse than some of the Missouri guys, but they go four deep legit. They've got Josh Landry, George, and Williams, and a couple of other guys who I can't think of off the top of my head. So they go 3-4 deep without much of a drop off, and Ohio State doesn't do that. So overall, when you factor in depth, which I think the only position where depth is not arguable in terms of it being very, very important is the defensive line, I am going to give a very slight edge to Missouri. Linebackers, I don't think this is much of a conversation. I think this is the most black and white in terms of comparing these two rosters. Right here is the linebacker position. Tommy Eichenberg, Steel Chambers, a couple of other players that rotate in there are much, much better than anything Missouri has to offer at that position. The DBs are the toughest conversation, maybe, because I do think Ohio State, even though their safety play hasn't been good for the most part, does have a clear-ish advantage there. But I think at the cornerback position, Missouri has a clear advantage as well. I've never been a fan of Denzel Burke. I think he's probably a third or fourth round pick, and they don't really have a whole lot else at the cornerback position right now. But I do think there is more of an advantage for the cornerbacks in Missouri's favor than there is an advantage at the safeties for Ohio State's favor. So because of that, I am going to give Missouri the edge at the defensive back position. Moving on to the matchups here. When it comes to the Ohio State quarterback versus the Missouri D, I am going to give an advantage to the Missouri defense as a whole, even though they do have things that can be exploited, and I expect Ryan Day to have a game plan ready to be able to exploit those holes. However, I think the inexperience of Devin Brown, or I guess somebody else if they end up playing, is ultimately the deciding factor there. When it comes to the offensive line versus the front seven, I am going to give the advantage to Missouri because I think the defensive line and their ability to rotate is going to be the differentiating factor, as they can stay at 100% and won't necessarily get worn down as much as potentially Ohio State's defensive line could. However, obviously, even though I think Missouri's CBs are pretty good, Ohio State has the advantage at the skill position. Even if they don't end up having Marvin Harrison Jr., I still think they'll probably have the advantage here. I think Emeka Ibuka would then just get the Marvin Harrison treatment and do very, very well. When it comes to Missouri's matchups, specifically the quarterback versus the defense, I actually think Cook has a pretty reasonable chance to have a good game here. He is pretty clearly, in my opinion, the best quarterback Ohio State has played this year, and I think they also have the best set of skill position players that they have played this year. Now, Ohio State's defensive line, provided their conditioning holds up, which may or may not happen, I think does have the advantage against the Missouri offensive line, simply because I think there are multiple first-round picks on this defensive line, and I don't think Missouri has that level of talent along the offensive line. Now, the Missouri skill position players versus the Ohio State back seven, in terms of coverage and stuff like that, I think that Missouri does have an advantage here. I do think they will have a pretty decent opportunity to move the ball fairly consistently. I don't think they're going to get any big plays. Ohio State has been very, very good at limiting big plays this year, and Missouri at times has also struggled to move the ball consistently without the big play. So I do believe that even though they have the advantage at the skill position versus back seven situation, it may not be the biggest or most impactful advantage that they have. Ultimately, when it's all said and done, I think this is a close football game, and I think Ohio State is going to miss Kyle McCord and his experience specifically in big games where he played well. And I think Missouri is going to pull off the W here, but only by a field goal. I got this game going 24-21. The final game we're going to talk about today is Florida State versus Georgia. And this could have been the game of games. But instead, both of these teams have gotten absolutely ravaged, bent over a table, whatever way you want to describe it, just utterly decimated by the transfer portal. They've both lost multiple starters and high-impact players, as well as a whole lot of depth. All that being said, Georgia has mainly lost that talent along the defensive side of the ball, and Florida State's kind of lost it everywhere. I mean, both of their top wide receivers have opted out. They've lost Patrick Payton to the transfer portal. Bell, the tight end, as well as wide receiver 3 have all declared for the draft and opted out. And they've lost a ton of depth to the transfer portal. I mean, the Florida State roster right now might only have like 60 players on it. And Georgia, even though they've lost some 5 stars and they've made a big deal about it, none of them played this year, really. They lost Dumas Johnson as well as a cornerback that got a significant amount of playing time as well. But outside of that, they haven't particularly lost a whole lot. There haven't really been a whole lot of opt-outs for this game either. And Georgia, I think, has the advantage at every single position. Quarterback, running back, skill, offensive line, defensive line, linebackers, DBs, they're better at all of them, even with all of the opt-outs and transfers. Now, really quickly, I'm going to go through what this would look like if Florida State was 100% healthy, except for Tate Rodemeyer, and all of the transfers / opt-outs are playing in this game. I think they would have the advantage at running back. I think they would have a serious conversation to be had about having the advantage at skill positions. I think they would both be elite. I think Georgia would still beat them on the offensive line. I think they would beat Georgia along the defensive line. I think Georgia would beat them on the secondary, and the linebacking core is 50-50. It's a toss-up. So this could have been a close game had the transfer portal and opting out of bowl games not been a thing. Florida State matchups, their quarterback versus the Georgia defense. Georgia has an advantage. The Florida State offensive line versus the Georgia front 7. Georgia has the advantage. The skill position players, with their top 3 players not playing, is at a significant disadvantage against the Georgia secondary. When it comes to Georgia's matchup, Carson Beck versus the Florida State defense, Carson Beck has the advantage. Offensive line obviously has the advantage against the front 7 that has had a ton of people opt out and transfer, and the skill position players have an advantage against a honestly not very good secondary from Florida State. The last time we saw Georgia lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game, we saw them come out pissed the fuck off and utterly destroy a decent Michigan team. And I fully expect them to do exactly the same against a Florida State team that, had they been healthy / not had players opt out / not had players enter the transfer portal, would have had a much better chance to win this game. My official prediction is Georgia 42, Florida State 10 in a very uninteresting game. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. So it's at this point I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if at any point you disagreed with me or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now, with the outro out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.